Hi, it's Melissa Gaston, and I'm the Find the Light photography blogger for YummyMummyClub.ca. Today, this quick video is just to show you the interrelationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and how they work together to form the exposure triangle. What you're seeing is the LCD screen from the back of my camera. I've plugged it into my computer. And for the moment, I'm going to stay in aperture priority mode. It's just going to make some of the automatic setting changes easier for you to see. So let's assume I'm taking this picture and I've decided I want a really short, shallow depth of field or a really blurred out background. And so I'm picking f2.8 as my aperture. My ISO I'm keeping at 200, not too dark, and want to keep my graininess level down. So when I press my camera, turn it on, here we go, and compose the photo, the camera automatically determines that based on these two settings and the available light around, my shutter speed should be 1/160th of a second. Now, let's say though that I want to increase my aperture because I want more of my photo in focus. So I'm going to crank that to be a larger aperture number, which is actually a smaller aperture opening. And let's say I want to go to f8. And now you'll see that my shutter speed has lowered to be only 1/25th of a second. So significantly longer shutter speed to compensate for the fact that I've decreased the size of my aperture opening for that photo. Now, if I wanted to not make my shutter speed that slow, because that's a relatively slow shutter speed, particularly if you're hand holding. So I'm going to then have to edit my ISO. I'm going to have to give up my graininess, because if I don't want to give up the amount of my picture that's in focus, and I still need my shutter speed to be faster, I have to get more light into the camera somehow. And I do that by changing the ISO. So let's increase the ISO. Let's increase it to 1,000 and see what happens. Much better. So now I have a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second, and my aperture is still f.8, or sorry, f8.0, and my shutter speed is something that's fast enough that I can actually handhold my camera and get the shot. Now let's take a look what happens when we're in shutter priority. So in this case, I'd use shutter priority where it's really important for me that I keep my shutter speed fast enough to keep whatever my subject is, might be your kids or your dog, or if you're at a sporting event, one of the players, in focus and not have their motion be blurred. So you want a nice crisp photo. So in that case, I want a shutter speed that's fast enough to capture motion, which this particular shutter speed isn't, or at least fast enough to handhold. So depending on what you're shooting. So 1/80th, let's say I want my shutter speed, and you'll see for what I'm pointing at now, the camera is setting the aperture to f5 and I've kept my ISO at 200. So let's say I want to increase my shutter speed. And so I'm going a bit faster, and as you see, I'll go back a bit, and if you watch over here, the aperture changes. So the aperture gets smaller, which makes the aperture opening larger, in order to let in more light. Because with a faster shutter speed, that's only keeping the shutter open for a small period of time. So as I go to 2.8, my shutter speed is at 1/250th of a second. Pretty fast, really good if your kids are moving around or you're watching them play soccer. That's a good shutter speed. Now, for some reason, I needed it to be much, much faster than that. The problem I'm going to have now is this particular lens I'm using doesn't go below f2.8. So in order to let more light in this exposure triangle, I need this to get faster, but this can't go any lower. So in order to allow me to get a faster shutter speed, I'm now going to have to increase my ISO. And let's go up to 1,000 like we did before and see what happens. So that's changed my f-stop, which is great, but now I have way more room to go up and still be adequately exposed and still within the functional ability of the lens I have on my camera. So just remember, in the exposure triangle, Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO all work together. You need to sort of determine which is the most important for the photograph you're trying to take. From there, you can make decisions on what settings you can change and what you're prepared to sacrifice. Shutter speed deals with motion and motion blur. Aperture shows you how much in your picture will be in focus, and ISO increases the graininess in your photo the higher it goes. I hope that helped you understand the exposure triangle a little bit more.